From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think there is no doubt in the world that Donald Trump wants to bring in his own de facto unconstitutional government, a coup d'etat in Venezuela against the people and democracy.
Venezuela is in a state of crisis as the country's elected leader, Nicolas Maduro, and U.S.-backed opposition leader, Juan Guaido, both claim to be Venezuela's president. The United Nations is calling for dialogue and is warning the situation could rapidly spiral out of control with catastrophic consequences. But the U.S. continues to ratchet up pressure on Maduro.
The time for debate is done. The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate. His regime is morally bankrupt. It's economically incompetent, and it is profoundly corrupt. It is undemocratic to the core.
We'll spend the hour looking at the crisis in Venezuela with two longtime observers of Venezuelan politics, Alejandra Velasco and Steve Elner, as well as Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin. She interrupted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech Thursday, holding up a sign that read, "A coup is not a democratic transition." All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate Thursday rejected a pair of spending bills aimed at ending the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, now in its 35th day. 6 Republicans crossed the aisle to vote in favor of a Democratic bill that would fund the government without meeting Trump's demand of $5.7 billion for a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. The 52-44 vote was a blow to Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, but failed to garner the 60 votes needed to break a filibuster. In an impassioned speech that lasted over 20 minutes, Colorado Democratic Senator Michael Bennet blasted Senator Ted Cruz and other Republicans for supporting the shutdown, but laid blame for the crisis at the feet of President Trump.
This idea that he was going to build a medieval wall across the southern border of Texas, take it from the farmers and ranchers that were there, and have the Mexicans pay for it, isn't true. That's why we're here. Because he's now saying the taxpayers have to pay for it.
A Republican-crafted bill with funding for Trump's border wall also failed Thursday. That reportedly prompted Republican lawmakers to angrily confront Mitch McConnell in a closed-door meeting over the shutdown and set off a flurry of negotiations on Capitol Hill. House Democratic leaders are floating proposals that would provide billions of dollars in new funding to pay for more Border Patrol agents, drones, surveillance equipment, and other measures along the U.S.-Mexico border. Democratic House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn has suggested offering Trump $5.7 billion to build a so-called smart wall in order to break the stalemate over the shutdown. Immigrant rights groups have blasted the suggestion, with the digital rights group Fight for the Future warning, quote, increasing border surveillance is a nefarious move that widely threatens the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This comes as some 800,000 federal workers who've been furloughed or forced to work without pay for over a month will miss a second paycheck today. Federal workers are increasingly turning to food pantries as they struggle to pay for housing, food, and other basic needs. Among them, more than 40,000 active-duty members of the U.S. Coast Guard. This is Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Carl Schultz.
I find it unacceptable that Coast Guard men and women have to rely on food pantries and donations to get through day-to-day life as service members.
Meanwhile, President Trump's Commerce Secretary, multi-millionaire investor Wilbur Ross, said Thursday federal workers should simply take out bridge loans until they get paid. Ross was being questioned by CNBC anchor Andrew Ross Sorkin.
There are reports that there are some federal workers who are going to homeless shelters to get food.
Well, I know they are, and I don't really quite understand why, because, as I mentioned before, the obligations that they would undertake, say a borrowing from a bank or a credit union, are in effect federally guaranteed. So the 30 days of pay that some people will be out there's no real reason why they shouldn't be able to get a loan against it.
Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, whose net worth is estimated around $700 million, also diminished the financial hardship faced by unpaid federal workers.
800,000 workers, if they never got their pay, which is not the case, they will eventually get it. But if they never got it, you're talking about 1/3% on our GDP. So it's not like it's a gigantic number overall.
Meanwhile, President Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, said this week federal workers are enduring a little bit of pain, but should be proud of the sacrifice they're making. Lara Trump was speaking with the online program Bold TV.
So in terms of the workers who are coming to work and not getting paid, what would you say to them?
Listen, it's not fair to you, and we all get that, but this is so much bigger than any one person. It is a little bit of pain, but it's going to be for the future of our country.
President Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, is President Trump's campaign advisor. Wilbur Ross and Lara Trump's comments came as state and local governments that administer food and housing assistance warned benefits to millions of Americans could begin drying up in mid-February due to the shutdown. Earlier this week, Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, called for a general strike aimed at ending the shutdown. Federal agents arrested President Trump's ally and former advisor Roger Stone early Friday morning, with prosecutors from special counsel Robert Mueller's team charging the longtime Republican operative with obstruction, witness tampering, and lying to Congress about his communications with WikiLeaks. An indictment unsealed Friday reveals that a senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone ahead of the 2016 election to see what other leaks about Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee were coming from WikiLeaks. That revelation suggests the Trump campaign knew about thousands of stolen Democratic emails before they were made public by WikiLeaks. Stone was arrested in Florida and will be brought to Washington, D.C. The State Department has ordered all non-emergency government employees to leave Venezuela after the Trump administration said it would no longer recognize Venezuela's elected president, Nicolás Maduro, and will instead recognize opposition leader Juan Guaidó. The partial evacuation came as Maduro said he's closing the Venezuelan embassy in the U.S. and ordered all U.S. diplomatic personnel to leave Venezuela by Sunday. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Thursday for all members of the Organization of American States to recognize Guaidó as interim president. Pompeo was speaking at an OAS meeting in Washington, D.C.
The time for debate is done. The regime of former President Nicolás Maduro is illegitimate. His regime is morally bankrupt. It's economically incompetent, and it is profoundly corrupt. It is undemocratic to the core.
Pompeo's speech was interrupted by Code Pink protester Medea Benjamin, who held up a sign saying OAS don't support a coup in Venezuela and declared a coup is not a democratic transition. Do not listen to Secretary Pompeo, before being forcibly removed by security guards. Medea Benjamin will join a roundtable discussion as we spend the rest of the hour on the crisis in Venezuela after headlines. The Trump administration says it'll begin sending some asylum seekers to Mexico while their cases are processed in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security said late Thursday it'll begin returning Central American asylum seekers to Tijuana, Mexico, across the San Isidro port of entry near San Diego, California, beginning today. Immigrant rights groups say the plan violates both U.S. and international asylum laws and are planning court challenges. Immigrant rights activists are calling for the release of Eduardo Samaniego, a 26-year-old undocumented immigrant and community activist who faces a possible deportation at an ICE hearing today. Samaniego moved to the U.S. from Mexico by himself at age 16, and after graduating as his high school class valedictorian, he went on to organize on behalf of undocumented young people known as Dreamers. Samaniego was arrested 3 months ago and detained by ICE and was recently transferred to a for-profit mental health facility in South Carolina, where his mental and physical health are reportedly deteriorating. Samaniego's supporters call him a political prisoner who's being targeted by the Trump administration for his activism. In Minnesota, 2 men admitted Thursday they bombed a Bloomington mosque in 2017 in a bid to terrorize Muslims into leaving the United States. No one was injured in the bombing, but it caused extensive damage to the Dar al-Farouk Islamic Center as worshippers were gathering for morning prayers. Michael McWhorter and Joe Morris pleaded guilty to 5 counts related to the mosque attack, as well as the attempted bombing of an Illinois abortion clinic and other crimes. A third suspect in the mosque bombing, Michael Harry, remains in federal custody. Harry is a former sheriff's deputy from Illinois who runs a security company and submitted a bid to build President Trump's border wall. In Sudan, anti-government protests continue to grow in size and scope Thursday, with demonstrators in several key cities calling on the authoritarian President Omar al-Bashir to step down after 3 decades of rule. A 24-year-old man died Thursday from wounds he received at an earlier protest near the capital Khartoum, raising the official death toll since protests erupted in mid-December to 29. Rights groups say more than 40 people have been killed by security forces and pro-government militias firing tear gas and live ammunition. Brazil's first elected openly gay federal lawmaker said Thursday he's leaving his post and has fled Brazil amidst growing homophobic violence coinciding with the rise of the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. John Villas, who first took office in Brazil's Chamber of Deputies in 2011, told a Sao Paulo newspaper he's received a number of death threats in recent weeks and has felt unsafe since his friend and political ally, Marielle Franco, an LGBTQ activist and Rio City Council member, was assassinated last March. 2 suspects in Franco's murder are members of a criminal syndicate who have ties to President Bolsonaro's son, Flavio. President Jair Bolsonaro has a history of making racist, misogynistic, and homophobic comments and has threatened to destroy, imprison, or banish his political opponents. Jean Willis was elected to a 3rd term in office in October. He will be replaced in Brazil's Congress by David Miranda, a Rio City Council member and husband of the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Back in the United States, Massachusetts Democratic Senator and 2020 presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren unveiled a plan Thursday that would shift the U.S. tax burden onto those who can most afford it, people with tax assets over $50 million. Warren says the proposed ultra-millionaire tax would raise $2.75 trillion over 10 years while impacting just 0.1% of Americans. In Binghamton, New York, school district officials are denying reports that 4 12-year-old African-American girls were strip-searched by a middle school nurse and assistant principal after they allegedly acted giddy during a school lunch. The school district's denial came after 200 people packed a school board meeting Tuesday evening to condemn the alleged incident, which they said left the 4 girls feeling humiliated and traumatized. The school board acknowledges the girls were detained on suspicion of possessing drugs, a suspicion that admits was unfounded, but denies the girls were strip-searched. New York City has agreed to pay $3.3 million to settle a lawsuit brought by the family of Khalif Browder, the Bronx resident who died by suicide in 2015 at the age of 22 after being held at Rikers Jail for nearly 3 years without trial for a crime he didn't commit. Khalif was just 16 years old in 2010 when he was sent to Rikers Jail on suspicion of stealing a backpack. He always maintained his innocence and demanded a trial. Instead, he spent the next nearly 3 years at Rikers, nearly 800 days of that time in solitary confinement. When not in solitary, Khalif was repeatedly assaulted by guards and other prisoners. Khalif's story led New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio to pledge in 2017 to close the Rikers Island jail in 10 years' time. In Florida, newly appointed Secretary of State Michael Ertel resigned Thursday, just hours after photos emerged showing him in blackface while wearing a shirt reading Katrina victim. The photos were taken at a Halloween party in 2005, just 2 months after Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, killing over 1,800 people and leaving much of New Orleans underwater. Ertel was appointed by Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, who narrowly defeated Democrat Andrew Gillum in November. Gillum is African-American, and during the campaign, he faced a string of racist attacks from outside groups and from DeSantis, who told Florida voters ahead of the election not to, quote, monkey this up. In Indiana, a school superintendent has been charged with 3 felonies and a misdemeanor charge after she used her son's name to get medical treatment for a sick student who didn't have health care. Casey Smitherman says she picked up the 15-year-old student earlier this month after the teen showed symptoms of strep throat. after a medical clinic refused to see the teen because he had no insurance. Smitherman took him to a second clinic and signed him in under her son's name. She then filled a prescription for antibiotics at a local pharmacy under her insurance. In a statement, Smitherman said, "As a parent, I know how serious this illness can be if left untreated, and I took him to an emergency clinic. I knew he did not have insurance, and I wanted to do all I could to help him get well." And in Brussels, Belgium, an estimated 35,000 children held a one-day school strike Thursday surrounding the European Parliament building, demanding urgent action on climate change. It was one of the largest student protests ever in the Belgian capital. Students said they're ready to skip classes once a week until their demands are met.
We think that if we skip every Thursday, so we don't go to school, that the big people in our country and in the world will say that it's a problem, and that they will do something about it.
The students are following in the footsteps of now 16-year-old Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who is leading the school strike movement globally. She is now in Davos, Switzerland, addressing leaders at the World Economic Forum. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Venezuela remains in a state of crisis as opposition forces, with the backing of the United States, attempt to unseat the government of President Nicolas Maduro. On Thursday, Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez said the military continues to stand by Maduro.
I alert the people of Venezuela that a coup is being carried out against the institutions, against our democracy, against our constitution, against our president, Nicolas Maduro, the legitimate president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
The Venezuelan defense minister's comment came one day after President Trump announced the U.S. would recognize opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's new president. Guaido, the new head of Venezuela's National Assembly, declared himself president on Wednesday during a large opposition protest.
On Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pledged to send $20 million to the Venezuelan opposition in the form of humanitarian aid to address the shortages of food and medicine caused in part by harsh U.S. sanctions. Pompeo made the announcement while speaking at the OAS, the Organization of American States.
The time for debate is done. The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate. His regime is morally bankrupt. It's economically incompetent, and it is profoundly corrupt. It is undemocratic to the core. I repeat, the regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate. We therefore consider all of its declarations and actions illegitimate and invalid.
Secretary of State Pompeo's speech was interrupted by Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin, who'll join us later in the broadcast. In other developments, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has ordered the U.S. to remove all of its diplomats from Venezuela, but Washington is ignoring the request, claiming Maduro no longer has authority to take such action. While the U.S. Embassy in Caracas is staying open, the State Department has ordered non-essential diplomats and embassy staff to leave Venezuela. Meanwhile, Maduro has ordered all of Venezuela's diplomatic staff in the United States to return home.
The crisis is happening just weeks after Maduro was sworn into a second six-year term following his victory in an election last May that was boycotted by several of the opposition groups. The international community remains split on the situation in Venezuela. On Thursday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged all actors to, quote, lower tensions and pursue every effort to prevent violence and avoid any escalation. Mexico and Uruguay have urged all sides to hold negotiations. On Thursday, Mexico's new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, spoke out against foreign intervention in Venezuela.
We should conduct foreign relations with the principles of non-intervention, of the self-determination of peoples, of peaceful solutions to disputes.
But many other countries in the hemisphere have joined with the United States in supporting the attempted coup. This includes Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. Here in the United States, the leaders of the Democratic Party have also largely supported Trump's actions. Meanwhile, UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet is warning the situation, quote, may rapidly spiral out of control with catastrophic consequences. She also called for an independent investigation into recent violence. At least 26 people have died since anti-Maduro protests broke out earlier this week.
We're joined now by two guests. Alejandro Velasco is associate professor at New York University, where he's a historian of modern Latin America. He's executive director, executive editor for NACLA Report on the Americas, and the author of the book Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics in the Making of Modern Venezuela. Velasco was born and raised in Venezuela. He just returned from Venezuela Tuesday. He's joining us from Chicopee, Massachusetts. And in Washington, Steve Elner is with us, former professor at the Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela, where he taught from 1977 until he retired in 2002, currently associate managing editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives. He's editor of Latin America's Radical Left and the forthcoming book, The Pink Tide, Experiences, Breakthroughs, and Shortcomings in 21st Century Latin America. Elner lives in Venezuela, but is currently visiting the United States. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Alejandro Velasco, let's begin with you. Your assessment of what's taken place so far. Are we seeing a coup in the making?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's no question, on the other hand, that the Maduro government lacks significant amount of popular support and to a significant extent also legal legitimacy. And as you just mentioned, I returned from a couple of weeks there just on Tuesday, and the level of discontent, especially among popular sectors that had previously strongly supported Maduro and certainly before him Chavez, is palpable. That has to do with prices, it has to do with public services. However, that does not translate, and it hasn't in the past, and it's unclear whether it does now, to support for the opposition, which on its own terms has advanced, certainly with these last few moves, and has advanced an agenda that is plunging Venezuela into a tremendous degree of political and social uncertainty.
Well, I'd like to ask Steve Elner, this whole issue of the economic situation in Venezuela, and to what degree the United States government has played a role. Most people are not aware of how the sanctions have had an impact on Venezuela, specifically, for instance, Citgo, the huge American-based subsidiary of the Venezuelan oil industry, which has not been allowed to remit back any of the money that it's making here in the United States back to Venezuela. Could you talk about those sanctions and the impact on the economy there?
Certainly one. The sanction that prohibits Citgo from remitting profits to Venezuela is a very important measure. It means that the Venezuelan government is being deprived of approximately $1 billion a year. But in addition to that, the sanctions also stipulate that Venezuela practically cannot refinance its foreign debt, which is something logical that any country facing a difficult economic situation would do. The sanctions prohibit U.S. financial institutions from having any transaction, any interaction with the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan state oil company, PDVSA. But in addition to that, there is a major impact in terms of discouraging commercial and financial interests throughout the world from any kind of transaction with Venezuela. There is a list of approximately 70 Venezuelan officials who are being sanctioned. And that translates into a situation in which the U.S. government, specifically Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, has undertaken different investigations, workshops with representatives of Japan, Europe, Latin America, in order to find out where the shell companies are. In other words, he has created a situation in which commercial interests throughout the world are afraid to have anything to do with Venezuela. That amounts to virtually an economic blockade.
We're going to go to break, then come back to this discussion. Steve Elner, Venezuela-based scholar and author. Also joining us from Massachusetts, Alejandro Velasco, Venezuelan, associate professor at New York University. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Escucha lo que digo, quiero que seas testigo. Vamos, ven al camino del levantamiento del latino. Escucha lo que digo, quiero que seas testigo. Vamos, ven al camino del levantamiento del latino. A levantarse temprano porque para luego es tarde. Tu ciudad, tu país, tu continente está que arde. Y un tren muy grande que va hacia la izquierda se expande por Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba y también los Andes. Le dedico esto a México, donde no hace falta léxico. Para decirle a mexicanos que reivindican lo étnico, necesario es sacar la fuerza, la dignidad, la cultura y la historia que está debajo de la ciudad. Porque es allí donde concentra la irreverencia, la insurgencia, resistencia, inteligencia, indiferencia entre la ciencia y las convicciones, como las de Tupac Katari, que hoy volvió hecho millones. Recuerdo a Pancho Villa, unió fuerza con Zapata para que el pueblo mexicano tuviese una vida grata, pero maltratan a estudiantes y hasta los matan, porque no les conviene ver cómo esto se desata. Escucha lo que digo.
Rising of the Latino by Dame Pa Matala. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue to look at what's taking place in Venezuela. I want to turn to Jorge Ariaza, Venezuela's foreign minister, Venezuela's former vice president as well, and Chavez's son-in-law, the former president of Venezuela. I spoke to him last week and want to turn to an unaired excerpt of that interview. I asked him about the increasing pressure on the Maduro government from the U.S. and other countries.
No, this has been happening since 1999. Our late president, Comandante Chavez, was also seen as a dictator, as a socialist dictator, and the United States government was behind the coup d'etat in 2002 and all this sabotage to our oil industry. So this has been happening because we have the objective, the goal of changing the model, of building a new democratic society, which we call the socialism of this new century. And we have the right to do it. And we are an independent and sovereign country. And the thing is that here in the United States, not in the United States, I must say, not the people of the United States, but the elite that is in power, that is ruling the United States, they believe that Latin America is their backyard. And they want to impose their model, and they want to have these presidents who are also businessmen and who follow the orders of the President of the United States. But we are not. So we're trying to build our own society, and in new terms, with equality, with access to health, to education, to housing, to culture, and that is our struggle. And of course, what happens is that in those terms, the U.S. elite and other countries, satellite countries of the United States, they are trying to isolate the Venezuela government. They're trying to stop this from happening, and it's not going to happen. But this is a difficult struggle, Amy, and we are really looking, and President Maduro has looked for all the paths, all the way for dialogue. We had a dialogue process last year with the opposition in Dominican Republic, hosted by the President of Dominican Republic and the former President of Spain, Rodríguez Zapatero. And when we reached the agreement, and we were there to sign the agreement, the opposition received orders from the State Department here, and they didn't sign. And then they didn't, some of the parties didn't register for the elections. And now they say that the elections were a fraud. And now they say that Maduro is not a president. That is all part of a coup d'etat in progress, encouraged and funded by the United States government.
And what does it mean to you that AMLO, the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the stance he has taken in support of Venezuela?
AMLO, the president of Mexico, is very important for Latin America at the moment. It's one of the most important countries. It has borders with the United States. And they are, with this new government, they are again a sovereign country, and they are trying to help not only Venezuela, they're trying to help Nicaragua, they're trying to help Cuba, they're trying to help the other countries. They want to have good relations with all the countries in Latin America, but they want to solve the Latin American issues in Latin America and no interventionism from the United States in our countries.
AMLO, President López Obrador refused to back the Lima Group's stance questioning Maduro's legitimacy. He said, "We've said with a lot of clarity that we're going to respect the constitutional principles of non-intervention in foreign policy matters. We don't interfere in internal matters of other countries, and we don't want the governments of other countries to meddle in matters that correspond only to Mexicans."
Yes, that's what every country has to do. We cannot be interfering. I mean, you say here in the United States that Russia interfered in the campaign of Trump and the elections, and that's not good. It shouldn't have happened if it happened. I believe it didn't happen. But the United States interferes every single, not day, every single hour in the Venezuelan issues, in the Cuban issue, Nicaraguan, and all over Latin America. So it's bad for Russia to interfere here, but it's good for Washington to interfere in Latin America. Of course, that's not fair. And I believe that the President of Mexico is right. We have to respect each other. We have to respect the principles of international law. I mean, if you join the United Nations, it's because you respect the internal affairs of the other states. It's because you respect the equality of states. It's because you don't have the right to interfere in other nations. That's not what the United States does. They have done wars in Iraq. President Trump said that we regretted that the United States invaded Iraq, because now the situation is worse than it was with Saddam Hussein, and the same in Libya.
That's Jorge Arriaza, Venezuela's foreign minister, speaking on Democracy Now! Last week. To hear the whole hour, you can go to democracynow.org.
Still with us is Alejandro Velasco, associate professor at NYU, where he's a historian of modern Latin America. He's just returned from Venezuela on Tuesday. And in Washington is Steve Elner, former professor and associate managing editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives. I wanted to ask Alejandro on this whole issue of the pretty open U.S. involvement in trying to do regime change in Venezuela. A colleague of mine from Puerto Rico, Jesus Davila, has been reporting now for several months, going back to October, that there's been ongoing meetings. There was a meeting supposedly, according to Davila, in October of Venezuelan leaders in Puerto Rico, where they met and developed a manifesto to justify the overthrow of President Maduro. And supposedly, according to that report, that John Bolton from the White House specifically approved of it. And then in early January, Jesus Davila reported that the coup was already scheduled, supposedly for between the 10th and the 15th of this month. It happened actually about a week later. But the only delay appeared to be that the opposition itself could not agree who would be the official leader of the coup. And now we know it's Juan Guaidó. Could you talk about the conflicts within the opposition and how open the U.S. has been in trying to institute regime change in Venezuela?
Yeah, no, that's it was astonishing, actually, on January 23rd. I don't think anybody really expected the rapid cascade of events. I mean, first in the morning, the United States announces that it would possibly recognize Guaidó as a legitimate president. Then about 15 minutes later, exactly that is what Guaidó said, that he was swearing in as president. And then minutes after that, you had the confirmation from the White House, then the Organization of American States with Almagro, who's been incredibly aggressive throughout these last few years vis-a-vis Venezuela, and then a cascade of other countries coming out. So the level of coordination suggests powerfully that this could not have just been very spontaneous. It must have had prior levels of consent and agreement. But it's not just that it comes from the last 2 weeks or even in January. This is now about a year and a half's worth of really, as we look back upon it in hindsight, of laying the foundations and the groundwork precisely for what happened on January 23rd. So after the election, after 2017, when there was a series, massive protest that happened against the government of Maduro, people like Almagro in the United States explicitly took to calling anybody in Venezuela who would try to negotiate or to run in the presidential elections a traitor. This is the words that they used, which powerfully suggests that the center of gravity of the opposition around 2017 and 2018 shifted from the domestic plane to the international plane. And although the conditions on the ground continue to get worse, in part because of the sanctions that Steve mentioned, but also because of tremendous degrees of corruption and mismanagement in the government itself, that lays the groundwork for that international pressure, especially sort of from more radical expatriate communities, to be able to say, well, the only solution here, as in fact Pompeo said at the OAS, was that the time is up. There's no room for debate. If you do not recognize Guaido as president, we as the United States will not recognize you and your dealings with Venezuela.
And Steve Eldner, this whole issue of the problems within the opposition, could you talk about that as well? I mean, there was people like Antonio Ledesma, Maria Corina Machado, Leopoldo Lopez. These have all become known as major opposition figures, but most of them don't have a deep following among the population in Venezuela.
Well, Juan, for one thing, the opposition in Venezuela is extremely discredited. That's something that the media, the mainstream media, really hasn't reported. It's true that Maduro's popularity has decreased. His popularity, acceptance may be between 20–30%. But the opposition also is very unpopular, and that's because the opposition lacks a program. At least it hasn't publicized its program. It has a program. It's a neoliberal program, but that hasn't been its message. Its message all along has been to oust Chavez, and now it's to oust Maduro. So the opposition is very unpopular. You speak to people on the ground, people who would never vote for Maduro, and they tell you that they very much dislike the opposition leaders because they have vacillated so much. Firstly, they don't have a program, they don't stand for anything, and so they're considered opportunistic. And secondly, because they vacillate so much. For instance, they promoted the demonstrations that Alejandro referred to in 2017, and then overnight, when the National Constituent Assembly, the ANC, called for gubernatorial elections in October of 2017, they ceased calling for demonstrations, they dropped the protests, and they participated in the elections. So they've gone back and forth, and they've been very much discredited. Now, the opposition, as Alejandro also stated, is divided. And there is a hardcore, radical opposition that is led by Maria Corina Machado, and there's a moderate opposition. Even though the entire opposition supports neoliberalism, the moderates support a dialogue with the government. For instance, two presidential candidates, ex-presidential candidates, and candidates of the two major traditional parties, AD and COPEI, that is Eduardo Fernandez and Claudia Fermin, who were presidential candidates in 1988 and 1993. They supported participation in the presidential elections that most of the opposition boycotted, and they support recognizing Maduro and promoting dialogue. So the opposition is divided. What the Trump administration has done has been to radicalize the situation in Venezuela and pull the rug out from under the moderates and favor the more radicals in the opposition.
I wanted to turn to President Trump's remarks before the UN General Assembly last September.
Currently, we are witnessing a human tragedy, as an example, in Venezuela. More than 2 million people have fled the anguish inflicted by the socialist Maduro regime and its Cuban sponsors. Not long ago, Venezuela was one of the richest countries on earth. Today, socialism has bankrupted the oil-rich nation and driven its people into abject poverty. Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay. Socialism's thirst for power leads to expansion, incursion, and oppression. All nations of the world should resist socialism and the misery that it brings to everyone. In that spirit, we ask the nations gathered here to join us in calling for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela.
So that's President Trump in September. And then over the next months, the troika of John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, Vice President Pence, and the Secretary of State Pompeo, as everything's going on in Washington and most recently with the shutdown, are consistently making statements on Venezuela. Threatening statements. In fact, talking about, for example, coining the term, like we knew, axis of evil from George Bush before he invaded Iraq, troika of tyranny. Alejandro Velasco, can you respond to what President Trump has said and also talk about the role of the United States in this coup that is taking place?
Yeah, I mean, as Arreaza said to you last week, this is U.S. intervention in Venezuela is nothing new. Back certainly in 2002, the United States supported the coup against Chavez, and ever since under Bush, and then less so to the extent that Obama was less involved in Venezuela because it was at the height of the pink tide and left-wing governments. But nevertheless, there was still significant pressure coming from the United States. So the idea that the U.S. is interfering in Venezuela by backing certain sectors of the opposition is not new. What is new is, as you mentioned before, just the openness and the brazenness with which it's been happening over certainly the last year in particular. And even though Bolton and Pompeo and Mike Pence certainly are the visible faces of it, the real driver behind this policy is actually Marco Rubio, Senator of Florida, where there's a significant amount of very radical expatriates who've come not just over the last year and a half or two, but back from 2001 and 2002, Venezuelans have settled in Miami, and they have now significant kinds of weights, the same kind of weight that Cuban exiles used to have. And so Marco Rubio has really been the one to whom Trump basically outsourced Venezuela policy. And I should make one thing clear vis-a-vis Venezuela's role in the United States' role in Venezuela. On the one hand, yes, of course, there is this, this intervention that has taken place. But on the other hand, the larger play here, I think, is not actually Venezuela. What's happening vis-a-vis Venezuela in terms of the United States and Pompeo and Bolton's vision is reasserting a control over the agenda in Latin America, basically reasserting hegemony that had been lost, really, under the pink tide. So this is, Venezuela is the staging ground, but really this is a much larger sort of continental move that is drawing players like Piñera in Chile, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, like Macri in Argentina to say, we are now turning back to the pre-pink tide days where it was the United States that primarily set the agenda for what happens in Latin America.
Well, but I'd like to follow that up with Steve Elner, because even though many of the pink tide countries have now been replaced by more right-wing governments, Latin America is not the Latin America of old. It's no longer the U.S. backyard. Clearly, China plays a much bigger role in Latin America now as a financier of projects and an investor. And just yesterday, President Putin warned the United States not to intervene in Latin America. So even Russia is exercising a much more sort of aggressive position toward what used to be called the U.S. backyard. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure. One, there are some experts on the right side of the political spectrum who claim that the pink tide is over. There is an article that Jorge Castañeda, the former foreign minister of Mexico, that was published in the New York Times, that stated that it was headlined, "The Latin American left is dead." But the fact of the matter is, as you stated, that the pink tide, those governments, those progressive governments, some more leftist than others, but governments that ruled in Brazil with Lula, the Kirchners in Argentina, in Uruguay, which the Frente Amplio, which is still in power, Bolivia, Ecuador with Correa, etc., they framed certain issues in terms of state intervention in the economy, in terms of economic nationalism, which had been a banner going way back in time, specifically in the case of Venezuela. The Venezuelan economy in the 1990s, in the age of neoliberalism, at the height of neoliberalism, the Venezuelan economy ceased to be Venezuelan practically. The privatization meant that foreign capital bought out state companies, in the case of steel, in the case of telecommunications, and that was happening with the oil industry. And the private sector as well, in the case of cement, two of the most important banks in Venezuela, the cement company and also the chocolate company, Savoy. So Chavez came along and he promoted economic nationalism. He renationalized those companies that had been privatized, that had been bought by foreign capital. And so it seems to me that this is a banner. Now, it's true, as some of the people in the opposition state, that some of these state companies have been mismanaged. But the fact of the matter is that they represent a symbol. The nationalization, the economic nationalism, represents a symbol. Just like the nationalization of oil in Mexico in 1938 represented a symbol, even though Pemex, the state oil company in Mexico, was poorly managed after that, but still it stands out as an important development in 20th century Latin American politics. Same thing with the social programs. The social programs have promoted participation, integration, incorporation of the marginalized sectors of the population, and a sense of empowerment. So those goals and those achievements of the pink tide governments will not be just wiped away. And the idea that the pink tide is out of the picture completely, I think, is really overstating things. What's going to happen in Venezuela, we don't know, but Morales is in power in Bolivia. The pink tide is in power in Uruguay. López Obrador was just elected in Mexico last year. So that the situation is definitely in flux. Let me also say,
very quickly, and then we have to break.
Sure. Let me also say that the alternative to the pink tide, which are the governments that are now in power, the conservative governments, these are not the traditional political parties that have that it used to have large backing. These are right-wing parties, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Piñera in Chile. These are very wealthy politicians. They're not the standard politicians of the old days. And so it really remains to be seen whether they can consolidate power in the short-term future.
Steve Illner, Venezuela-based scholar and author, I want to ask you to stay with us, along with Alejandro Velasco, associate professor at NYU. We're going to break, and we'll also be joined by Medea Benjamin, who just interrupted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as he addressed the Organization of American States. Stay with us.
Simón Bolívar, Simón, caraqueño americano, el suelo venezolano, le dio la fuerza a tu voz. Simón Bolívar, Simón, nació de tu Venezuela y por todo el tiempo vuela como candela tu voz, como candela que va señalando un rumbo cierto en este suelo cubierto de muertos con dignidad.
Simón Bolívar by Lima Oliver. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
On Thursday, Code Pink's Medea Benjamin disrupted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech before the Organization of American States. She held a sign that reads, OAS, don't support a coup in Venezuela, Code Pink.
More violence in Venezuela.
While security was called in to remove Medea Benjamin, many in the room applauded her actions.
Por favor.
We're joined right now by Medea Benjamin, joining us from Washington, D.C. Medea, explain what happened yesterday, what Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was saying, and why you interrupted.
I interrupted because I'm really worried about what is about to happen in Venezuela. First, let's recognize how many millions of people in Venezuela are already suffering from the economic crisis, but how much worse it could get. The U.S. is helping to set the stage for a civil war in Venezuela. And so I thought it was important to get in there and say that we have to stop this from happening. We have to stand up and say that we believe in the principles of non-intervention, and we call for negotiations to end this crisis, not to follow in the footsteps of what the U.S. is doing, which is putting pressure on the Venezuelan military to divide it and to really set the stage for tremendous violence in Venezuela. So it's important for the left in the United States to stand up, not to say we love Maduro, but to say we're against U.S. intervention. It's important to call on our members of Congress. Where are they? Where are the progressive leaders? We've only had a handful, like Congressman Ro Khanna, Tulsi Gabbard, one of the new ones, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, but the rest of them have been silent. So I think it's important that we stand up, and before it is really too late, we call on the U.S. to back off, to not support a parallel government in Venezuela, and to say no to a coup.
Medea, were you surprised by the reaction to your protest? It's not the type of reaction you normally get when you do a disruption in Washington.
Well, I don't know, actually, if the applause was in support or the applause was to drown me out. So it's not clear, but the OAS is very divided.
On Capitol Hill, the Democratic establishment has largely supported President Trump's efforts to oust Maduro. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tweeted Thursday, "America stands by the people of Venezuela as they rise up against authoritarian rule and demand respect for human rights and democracy." Senator Dick Durbin tweeted Thursday, "I spoke at length to the new president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, today. I assured him of my strong support for a more peaceful and democratic future in Venezuela under his transitional leadership. The people of Venezuela deserve it." But there are many others who are not in agreement. Some voices of dissent in Congress. Independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted, "The Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was reelected last year in an election many observers said was fraudulent. The economy is a disaster and millions are migrating. The United States should support the rule of law, fair elections, and self-determination for the Venezuelan people. We must condemn the use of violence against unarmed protesters and the suppression of dissent. But we must learn the lessons of the past and not be in the business of regime change or supporting coups, as we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil, and the DR. The U.S. has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down that road again." And Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California tweeted, "Let me get this straight. The U.S. is sanctioning Venezuela for their lack of democracy, but not Saudi Arabia. Such hypocrisy. Maduro's policies are bad and not helping his people, but crippling sanctions or pushing for regime change will only make the situation worse." Democratic Hawaiian Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard, who's running for president, tweeted, "The United States needs to stay out of Venezuela. Let the Venezuelan people determine their future. We don't want other countries to choose our leaders, so we have to stop trying to choose theirs." And Minnesota Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted, "A U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela is not a solution to the dire issues they face. Trump's efforts to install a far-right opposition will only incite violence and further destabilize the regime. We must support Mexico, Uruguay, and the Vatican's efforts to facilitate a peaceful dialogue." This split in the U.S. Congress around Venezuela, Medea Benjamin.
Yes, I think this is because there's a small group of Venezuelans in Florida that is setting the agenda, and the rest of us are quiet. So we've got to get out on the streets. We've got to get on the phones, call your congressperson, 202-224-3121, and tell them to put out a tweet, a statement, a resolution calling for non-intervention. This is absolutely urgent. And anybody in the D.C. area, join us in front of the White House Saturday at 1 o'clock.
I want to turn back to Steve Elner and ask you about, you've written some interesting pieces, not just about what's happening within the opposition, but also within the pro-government forces and the political, that there are differences between the Maduro wing of the Bolivarian movement and other wings have a different perspective on how to deal with the crisis. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes, there is a degree of pluralism within the Chavista movement. These are leaders who support Maduro, but they have different priorities. They take a very firm position on the issue of corruption, which Alejandro referred to. For instance, Elias Hauer, who was one of the main leaders under Chavez and supports Maduro 100%. But he has a different take on economic policy. So there's a degree of diversity within the Chavista movement. And as long as the pressure is on the Maduro government, as long as you have this ongoing kind of aggression on the part of the United States, but also what political scientists call a disloyal opposition, an opposition that doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the government, which has been practically the opposition's position almost from the very beginning. These differences within the Chavista movement are not going to really come to the fore because Chavez and Maduro, their slogan is unity, unity, and more unity. That is perceived as necessary given the political context. But if the situation were to loosen up, if there were to be greater stability and less threats to the overthrow of the government, it's quite likely that you'd see more diversity and more debate within the Chavista movement.
Alejandro Velasco, who is Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, who's just announced that he is the president of the country in the streets?
Four major opposition parties in Venezuela. It's called Voluntad Popular, Popular Will, which is led visibly by Leopoldo Lopez, who was jailed after leading a series of protests in 2014. And this party has really sort of grown from a position of significant confrontation with the government. It's been known largely as one of the more radical of the opposition wings, as Steve mentioned or alluded to before. What's interesting about Guaido, however, is that he was kind of a backbencher, even within Voluntad Popular and the opposition more generally, because so many of Voluntad Popular's people have been either jailed or pushed into exile or barred from running for office. He kind of just emerged as the visible leader of the party after what had been a negotiation among those major political parties of the opposition to rotate the presidency of the National Assembly one each year through the 5-year period of the Assembly following their victory in 2015. So this year it was Voluntad Popular's turn, and Guaido was the person standing, and so that's why he came out.
So
but he was largely
in the last minute, though, I want to ask each of you the path forward. I mean, there's going to be a showdown this weekend with the U.S. Saying they're not going to leave Venezuela. Guaido says they can stay, and the elected president Maduro says they can't. What do you see as the path forward? Alejandro.
It has to be negotiations, right? I mean, so Uruguay and Mexico, and to some extent, the real key player here is going to be, I think, the European Union, which has been kind of wavering a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, they'd issued a report about having a group of contact, and so those are the measures that have to be supported, because otherwise Venezuela right now is on a knife's edge, and you have the tremendously high-stakes game of chicken being played right now with Venezuelans' lives at stake.
Yeah, I agree with Alejandro. The way forward is negotiations and dialogue. For one reason, because the decisions that the government is going to have to make, whether it be the Chavista government or a government of the opposition, whatever government takes necessary measures
We have
in
10
order to correct
seconds.
the economic situation, they will need a consensus. They will pay a political price, and if you don't have a consensus, it will be politically infeasible for the government to carry out these measures, these difficult economic measures, as a way out of the crisis.
We have to leave it there. Steve Elner, former professor and associate managing editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives. Thank you to Alejandro Velasco and Medea Benjamin. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.